Howdy, this is James Downard in Spokane, Washington, doing my very first video using my brand new camera and audio, making sure that all the things actually function. I've been an activist in trying to show that anti-evolutionism is a pile of dingoes' kidneys, and in my Troubles in Paradise project, I've been building up a big data set to show that that's the case. My latest little project, ta-da! Evolution Slam Dunk. Why the reptile-mammal transition proves macroevolution and how anti-evolutionists ignore it is now out for sale on Amazon.com and Barnes & Noble and all the different ebook formats. It frustrated me that the reptile-mammal transition, which is one of the most spectacular anti-evolution evidence cases around, isn't really well known. It's not used a lot. Dinosaurs get all the fancy press, and I'm a big dinosaur lover, so I enjoy them. But the reptile-mammal transition as a transitional fossil case is really neat. It doesn't suffer from some of the limits that you find with birds or whales or others where you have sparse fossil records in certain cases. And it's also, the mammals are great because that's us. So I'm going to give you a little primer about what the kinds of things you can do showing about the reptile-mammal transition without using any PowerPoints or special equipment, because it's all carried around on our own bodies. As I described in the book, we've got a fascinating thing to get from a reptile jaw to a mammal jaw. That's something that absolutely has to happen for the reptile-mammal transition, and it was a puzzle as to how it would work. It was known ever since the 1830s that all mammals start out with the reptile jaw layout, which is a dentary bone where the teeth are, and then a bunch of bones behind them, and it's that backbone, the articular bone, that actually hinges with the skull up in the quadrate bone. Ta-da! Mammals, however, are weird. We're the only ones that have a gigantic dentary bone, including that zygomatic arch up here and that coronoid process. You would all know that from a skeleton that you'd see in a Halloween costume, but that's a standard mammal layout. And that big dentary bone doesn't hinge on the same bone in the skull as the reptiles and everybody else does. It hinges on the squamosal bone. So how the hell can you jump from one to the other and remain functional all the way through? In the late 19th century, they'd started to find these synapsid reptiles. Air quotes reptile. There are taxonomists that go apeshit over describing them as reptiles, and I go into the details of why that's the case in the book, but I'll skip that. We've got these funny, funky synapsid reptiles, and it's just a fancy word for the number of skull holes they have up in here that they use for muscle attachments. In fact, that one skull hole is eventually going to morph around to be that zygomatic arch that we have in the mammals. Diapsids, their big rivals, have two skull holes, and they're the ones that are in the archosaur group. They go off into the dinosaurs and finally into birds. Fascinating bunch. Crocodiles are all in that bunch too. Now, these synapsids were really kind of popular animals. At the time before the Permian mass extinction, they were the dominant land animals, so we actually have quite a good fossil record on it. And they were starting to see in the 19th century that these synapsids were having more and more mammally-looking jaws. They were having a bigger and bigger and bigger dentary bone, and the skull was kind of shifting around, and their suspicion began to arise that maybe they might have been the group that the mammals evolved from. Around 1913, a mammal paleontologist named Robert Broom, who later on in the 1920s got to be really famous because he dug up Australopithecines and that's on our human evolution side of the case, was looking at this stuff, and he thought, you know, there's only one possible way that you can get from this reptile jaw layout to a mammal jaw layout and do it functionally without having any weird jumps in between. And that is that the bones had shifted around to where the future mammal jaw hinge on the jaw is going to be just adjacent to where that articular bone was, that the dentary bone had become dominant and it had that other bone right underneath it, and that the skull bones had morphed around to where the quadrate bone and the squamosal bone were right next to each other, and that a new muscle attachment was formed, and we now know developmentally it's based upon the tendons and things that exist naturally in that system. So you have basically a double-jointed animal. No animal like that existed in nature. It was completely proposed on evolutionary grounds as the only possible way that you could shift. And that eventually the idea would be that the mammal jaw hinge becomes the dominant one and the other one disengages, and eventually those bones turn into the inner ear, middle ear bones in mammals. Well, in 1932, they started digging up these fossils that were matching his prediction. So that's why there's this Diarthognathus brumi that was named for him, and also these other groups, the Probanognathids, that are these double-jawed transitional forms. The extra bones that the mammals use, we still use them, but they're up in our middle ear. And indeed, the genes that are used to govern the old reptile versions of them in our cousins still are used by the versions of them that we are still using up in our jaws. So, to me, that's one of the most spectacular examples of co-opting, where we have the actual physical fossils predicted in advance, fulfilled, and of which they absolutely have to have exactly that in order to work. That's why I think the reptile-mammal transition is a slam dunk. Now, when you look at how anti-evolutionists deal with this data, they don't. And I go through in the book every single case of an anti-evolutionist. There's not all that many. There's a couple dozen of them since Duane Gish in the 1980s down to Michael Denton currently in 2016. And I cover them all, the intelligent designers, the young earth creationists, and I go into the whole 9 yards about this. So this is kind of a primer to show you that you've got a really spectacular case of macroevolution, the reptile-mammal transition, that we ought to be using more, and we may need to do that more in the coming few years because of the new administration, which has a bunch of creationists in the cabinet. The vice president, Mike Pence, is very creationist friendly, and we need all the best ammo we have so that we can get ahead of the game rather than being behind. That's my opening salvo on the macroevolutionary processes and the reptile-mammal transition. Thank you, James Downard in Spokane, Washington.